Let's get into some other issues, though, with my new Thursday regular, former Liberal MP for Boothby in South Australia, Nicolle Flint. Nick, let's pick out where Tony Abbott left there, and we talked about coal and we talked about decarbonising the country. If that's where you're headed, if that's where Australians have voted to go, we close the Liddell Power Station. 10% of New South Wales power goes on the 28th of April. And we know there's another power station that goes 2 years after that. That's about 22% of New South Wales power. All the way along, we've been promised that when these blue-collar jobs go in these regional communities, along will come all these green jobs. Well, mining and energy union boss, Tony Marr, has hit out at the anti-coal brigade today. He says, yeah, that's all fine for you blokes, but you're not living in these communities. And when these jobs go, livelihoods and homes are hit hard. You're from a regional community, from a rural farm, so you know what it's like when jobs go in local communities. What's your take on this? Because these green jobs haven't materialised.
That's right, Peter, and it will be absolutely devastating for these communities. So it's not just the false promise of the green jobs that have been outsourced to China. It's also the fact that when we go to this mythical, completely renewable energy future, how are ordinary businesses, manufacturing businesses, energy-intensive businesses going to be able to afford to employ people when electricity prices have gone even further through the roof? So it's not just the direct coal jobs that are going to be lost, it'll be jobs throughout the economy. This is hugely concerning. What's also concerning, Peter, is the fact that undoubtedly the Australian taxpayers will be left to pick up the compensation for these for all of these workers when they lose their jobs, and they should be compensated because they're not losing their jobs through any fault of their own. They're losing their jobs through direct Labor government action. So it's a sort of a triple whammy, really, Peter, for Australia when it happens, and it's already happening.
I said at the top of the show that Paul Keating had taken a swipe at one of the Credlin regulars, and of course that's Greg Sheridan. If you read the piece in the Australian newspaper today, particularly nasty. I mean, I know there's vitriol and invective that comes from Keating on a regular basis, but this was particularly nasty. He accused Greg Sheridan of a display of his spiteful, vacuous journalism. And I don't think anyone listening to Greg Sheridan or reading Greg Sheridan would say he's vacuous. Keating criticised Greg and the Labor government, to be fair, for their support of AUKUS. He was writing about them being little Americans, a little army of little Americans dominate Australia's foreign policy. Now, I think this is, well, I don't want to say what country Keating tends to support more than America, but let's see this for what it is.
Yes, Peter. Paul Keating did seem to be particularly grumpy and, as you've said, nasty as well in his attack on Greg Sheridan. I think Greg might have slightly provoked him, though, with his opinion piece on The Australian on Tuesday. And anyone who hasn't read them both, it's quite an entertaining read. And from Greg's perspective, I hope he's thrilled because there's no greater compliment that can be paid to a journalist or a columnist than to have the subject of their column pen a scathing response. And Greg comes out of this beautifully and brilliantly because Paul Keating's arguments were actually quite confused. He seemed to be saying, oh, Australia shouldn't really have anything. We don't need the USA. We should stand on our own 2 feet. You know, we should be engaging better with our region. Completely, but then admitting that they are our key ally and that we need them for our national defence were something major to happen in our region as it has in the past. So it was a confused piece by the former Prime Minister, and full congratulations to Greg Sheridan for letting us have some very entertaining reading in The Australian this week.
Here. Now, Roald Dahl, we talked about this last night with Kel Richards about the rewriting of children's books. And I know it's almost humorous that they can't say the word fat in there and the Oompa Loompas are gender neutral. But you dig into it and it's incredibly sinister. And you go back to Orwell's 1985. I know we bandy around that term, oh, this is Orwellian and that's Orwellian. But let's remember what Orwell wrote in 1984 about old Winston. He said, and I'll quote, and presently some master brain in the inner party would select this version or that, would re-edit it, and then the chosen lie would pass into permanent records and become truth. Now, this is front of mind for me, not just in rewriting books, Nicolle. But the way in which we're going down the path, we saw it today with legislation in Queensland about these truth-telling commissions allied to Australian history.
Yes, absolutely, Peter. And we're sort of seeing it with our entire past and our history. Everyone wants to try and rewrite what happened and the outcomes for Australians. What is really concerning, though, is that these are kids' books, Peter. You want kids to have an imagination. You want them to explore fantasy worlds. You want them to be creative. And really what they're doing is just sort of dumbing it down. Also, putting words like fat in there are actually a good jumping off point for parents to say, well, hang on, that's not actually a nice thing to say. And Roald Dahl's using them in context, for goodness sake. So it's absolute madness. It just shouldn't be happening. And it's really disappointing to not see more contemporary kids authors come out and defend Roald Dahl.
All right, we'll leave it there. Nicolle Flint, see you next week.